Today we're going to start tiling, but first we need to move all these cabinets.
If you're new to the channel, we're currently building a bar in my basement. In previous episodes, we've built and painted all those cabinets that you see, and in today's episode, we're going to be installing the tile that goes underneath them. After taping out the rough dimensions of where the tile's going to go, I began cutting up the carpet. This was a little bit scary because there's no going back at this point, so I triple checked my dimensions and then I cut it out with a utility knife, which was actually pretty easy. I also took out the foam underneath, and then I took out the baseboards and tack strips around the perimeter. Once that was all complete, I came back with the vacuum to clean up a bit, but Olive was not a fan.
Now this may look like cement, but it's actually a 1/4-inch foam pad that was used on the old carpet a long time ago, and it was actually glued down, so it's going to be a little tricky to pull up, right Olive? So let's see how we do. Olive, you're in the shot.
As you might be able to tell, this stuff was not easy to pull up. I actually told the carpet installers that installed the new carpet just to put their foam pad directly over it because it would probably take days for them to clear out the entire basement of this stuff. Surprisingly, I found that an ice scraper worked best to actually pull this stuff up. It was permanently glued down onto the concrete subfloor, so it took quite a lot of elbow grease to pull it off. I was able to complete about 80 or 90% of the floor with just the ice scraper, but some of it was extremely stubborn, so I had to break out the hammer drill to get those areas. Once I had the bulk of it done, I cleaned up around the edges so that we had room for our detra mat that we'll be installing a little bit later in the video. There was also a couple nails that were proud of the surface that were holding down the old tack strips. I couldn't get them with the hammer, so I pulled out the hammer drill for those too.
So I think this is as clean as we're going to get it. I gave it a quick vacuum to make sure that there's no dust. The next step is to pre-cut all of our detra membrane, and then we can start mixing up our mortar. And you can actually see the outline of the old bar because that's where the carpet strips were.
Here you can see an up-close look of what the floor actually looks like. As you can see, I didn't get all of the foam, but I did get a majority of it, and I also think those grooves will help adhere the mortar to the floor. So here's that detra membrane that I was talking about a bit earlier, and here's a helpful tip for marking out any holes that you need to cut. I just lined up the side of it with where the drain and water lines are coming out in the floor, and then ran a Sharpie line across and see where they intersect, and then I just cut out that hole with a utility knife. What's really nice about detra is it's super easy to cut, and it's also really lightweight, so it's easy to work with.
Well, that's kind of unfortunate. We only need maybe about 4 or 5 more square feet, but we're just short. Luckily, I do have a second roll, but we have to open up a whole 100 square feet roll just to cover this small area, but hopefully I can use it somewhere else later down the line. There we go. So now I need to pull this all back up, mix up our mortar, and put it back down. Alright, so my bucket full of water here, inside is 8 quarts. I'm going to mix in a full 50-pound bag of Schluter All Set, which pairs nicely with the detra membrane, and then I'm going to mix it up with my mixer here, and then once it's ready to go, I'm going to be spreading it with a 3/16 by 1/4-inch V-notch trowel. Let's get to it.
If you are going to mix the full 50-pound bag into the 5-gallon bucket, I would just start by putting half the bag in, mix that, and then pour the other half in, just because it fills the bucket almost all the way to the top.
Alright, so we're going to actually let this sit up for about 10 minutes, not touching it, then we're going to mix it again for another 3 minutes, and then we can start troweling it onto the ground.
After putting a few dollops of the All Set on the ground, I'll come in with the flat side of my trowel to spread it out, and then I'll come in with the V-groove side to create all of the grooves. Keep in mind that you want this All Set to be a little bit wetter than you'd use for setting tile. I just followed the instructions on the bag to make sure I had the right water to mortar mixture. Then once you've troweled all your grooves, you can start to roll out the detra. Now the reason that we're using this is so that the tile doesn't crack. You're not supposed to put tile directly on concrete because all of the cracks in the concrete will transfer to the tile. So this detra is an uncoupling membrane which allows the concrete and tile to be separated and not transfer any cracks between the two. Also, you saw me pull up that corner there. That's to make sure I had proper coverage of the mortar underneath the detra.
I think the camera may have cut out there at the very end, but we're all done. The last piece went in nicely, so we're just going to let it dry, and then we can start tiling tomorrow.
While the mortar's set up, I cut some Schluter strips on the miter saw, and these are black aluminum strips that will cover up the edge of the tile that meets the carpet, and they'll give it a nice clean finished edge.
I prefer to pre-cut all my tiles before mixing up my mortar, so I use my measuring tape to measure out exactly 112 inches, which is the width of the bar, and I cut this tile, which was a full tile, and now it's the exact size that I need. Then for the next row, I'm going to be offsetting the tiles by half a tile, so I cut that out already, and then I know if I'm going to have full tiles all the way here. At the end, I'm going to have a little bit of a sliver to put up against the wall. So now we can cut a few more of these tiles for the rest of the rows, and then we can start mixing up our mortar. Let's get to it.
If you are going to be doing a relatively large tile job, I highly recommend picking up a wet saw, which is what you see here. They do make manual tile cutters that just crack the tile instead of actually cutting through it with a blade, and those do work, but I would use those for mainly smaller tiles, but for large format, I think a wet saw would work best.
I also need to pre-cut the tiles around this floor drain and the water lines. The floor kind of slopes up in this area, so I'm going to probably cut at least an inch around it. And that's not a big problem because it's going to be all covered with cabinets anyway, so you'll never see it.
The other nice thing about a wet saw is that you can make more complex cuts. With a manual cutter, it's pretty much a straight line all the way across the tile, where in this case you can make a variety of different cuts and different angles.
So we just finished cutting all the tiles for this area, so now we can start mixing up our mortar. I'll probably start with half a bag, that way I don't mix up too much and it hardens on me before I can use it all.
Now we're going to start by spreading out the mortar similar to how we did before with the flat side of the trowel, making sure to fill all the holes of the D-trap. I'm then going to add a bit more mortar and start spreading it out with the notch side of the trowel. In this case, I'm using a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch square notch trowel. Then once that's complete, you can go ahead and grab your tile, and I actually made a mistake right there. Let me know down in the comments if you caught it, but I'm going to fix that here in a minute. Once I put the tile into the mortar, I apply some downward pressure and move it back and forth to break down the grooves, and then I add some tile leveler clips. I then move on to the next tile, making sure to spread out my mortar, and here you can see me fixing my technique. I forgot to back butter the very first tile. Back buttering is when you apply mortar to the back side of your tile in addition to the mortar that's already on the D-tra, and this makes sure that you get proper adhesion. I did go back and make sure that I back buttered the first tile, by the way. Then once the second tile was in place, I added in my tile levelers, and this makes sure that both tiles are flush with one another. Then it's just a rinse and repeat process from there. Or at least I wish it was that easy. This tile was pretty difficult to install because I had to slide it underneath the carpet. I wish I could cut the carpet back just a little bit more, but I had to leave it at this length so the carpet installers could reinstall it properly. And that outside corner that I can't see at all will probably be the most visible corner of the tile, so it was quite stressful.
Alright, so now we have the entire first row in, but while the mortar is still wet, we're going to add our Schluter strip on the front edge here, and then we'll start working this way with our rows. And I know this is a bit hard to see because of the carpet, unfortunately it's just the way that it is, but I'm going to install the Schluter strip on this side of the tile now because this is technically the corner, so we have to put this in while that mortar is still wet as well. And this is a YouTube exclusive because I'm having to use my phone as a flashlight, so I can't record the TikTok at the moment.
Similar to installing that tile in the corner, installing the Schluter strip was just as difficult as I could not see at all in that corner. Luckily I was able to get it sorted, and then I was just checking to make sure that all my tiles had full coverage on the backside. Everything looked good, so let's get to work.
So it's the next day, I let the mortar sit up overnight. Now we can pull off all of our spacers and levelers and get started on the next couple of rows. Let's get to it. Alright, so we just finished up another 2 rows. I'm going to go ahead and eat lunch, and then we're going to come back and hopefully finish the rest of this today. It's going to be a little bit tricky because I like to start on the end with a Schluter strip, that way I get it nice and tight, and then if this joint over here is a little bit loose, it's okay because it's going to be covered with either cabinets or a baseboard. However, if I start over there, I'm going to work myself into a corner and then it's going to be hard to get out, but I might do like all 3 rows at once and work my way this way. We'll see. But anyway, let's go eat some lunch. And we're back. Lunch was very good. I had an almond butter jelly sandwich. It was fantastic. So now before I start mixing up our next batch of mortar, I wanted to pre-cut all the tiles that are going to go up against the wall. That way I have everything ready to go. As you can see, these 2 tiles are not mortared down. I just laid them out here so I could get an accurate measurement on this side, making sure to use spacers. This measurement came to about 7 inches, which is what this tile is. It's a perfect fit, so now I'm going to cut a few more for the rest of this row, and then we can start mixing up our mortar.
This isn't just DIY content, we also got ASMR content too. We got all the acronyms here at Golden Key. But anyway, here I am cutting those 7-inch strips of tile so we can start to mortar them in place. I decided to work on all 3 rows at once, starting on the Schluter strip side, and that's because this is what you're going to see as you walk up to the bar, so I wanted this section to look nice and clean. All of these tiles are going to be underneath cabinets, so I wasn't too concerned. However, I did want them to be perfectly level, as I didn't want to have to shim the cabinets later on. Now, I did start working myself into a corner, so I was getting a little bit nervous. However, I was able to carefully step on the rows I had laid previously as I laid the last few tiles in place.
Man, that was tough, but I'm glad we were able to get the whole thing done today. Now we can let it set up overnight, and then we'll grout tomorrow.
The next day, I was able to take out all of the spacers as well as the levelers, and the yellow ramps are actually reusable, so I had to separate those from the white plastic pieces.
Before I start grouting, I want to make sure that I clean up all the excess mortar, so I'm going to take a sponge to go over all the tiles to make sure they're all clean. Then I'm going to look through all the grout joints and make sure there's no mortar sticking up above the surface, and if there is, I'll just use a utility knife to scrape it out.
As you can see, some warm water really makes light work of the excess mortar. You just want to make sure that you do this step between 12 and 24 hours after you first lay the tile, that way the mortar hasn't fully set up yet. Once that was complete, I cut back the extra detra that was beyond the excluder strip. When I first installed it, I made sure to give myself a little bit of a buffer because it was easy enough to cut back flush after the fact. For the grout, I'll be using Ultra Color Plus FA, which is basically a hybrid between sanded and unsanded grout. On the back of the bag, there's a nice chart that shows with my 12 by 24 tile and an 1/8 inch grout joint, I'll be able to cover over 200 square feet with just this one bag. For this project, I only need to cover 60 square feet, so I decided to mix up half the bag, and if it dried out too quickly, which this product is notorious for doing, I can always go to the other half of the bag and mix up a second batch if needed. Luckily, I worked fast enough that I was able to cover all the tile with that first batch, not needing to mix up a second one. I then came back to where I started about 15 minutes after to start wiping it with the sponge. Here I learned a new technique. Rather than wiping the sponge back and forth and just moving the grout all over and not really cleaning anything, as you can see here, I wipe it in one long streak in one direction, flip the sponge over to get the other side, and repeat the process with one long streak, and then I rinse it with water right away, and this seemed to clean it a lot faster. Another helpful tip is to dump your bucket of wastewater and fill it with some nice clean water every 5 minutes or so.
It's now the next day, the grout has fully set up and the tile is all done. I think this might be my best grouting job that I've ever done. I think I finally found my technique for wiping with the sponge so that there's no haze left over. I'm not going to be able to show it in this video, but I have some carpet guys coming in a couple days to put some tack strips around the perimeter of the tile and then tuck the carpet in. It's a bit unfortunate because I was really excited to show you guys the finished product with that carpet tucked in. I think it's going to make a huge difference, but unfortunately I have to wait for next week's video when we do the cabinet install. So get subscribed and stay tuned and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please smash that like button as it really helps out the channel. And as always, thanks for watching and happy building. See you next week. Alright, now this might look like cement. Hello? I'm filming.